She had learned, by the age of 24, the particular art of becoming invisible. It was not something she had been taught, not precisely. No governess had sat her down and instructed her in the finer points of self-erasure. No mother had whispered the secret into her ear before bed. It was something Eleanor Ashworth had absorbed, the way one absorbs a language heard constantly but never directly spoken to, through observation, through repetition, through the slow accumulation of 1,000 small moments in which the world looked directly at her and found nothing worthy of remark. She had a sister, you see, and that made everything simpler and everything harder in equal measure. Arabella Ashworth was the kind of woman poets embarrassed themselves over. She had golden hair that caught the light as though it existed solely to be caught, blue eyes the precise shade of a summer sky at midday, and a laugh that arrived in a room several seconds before she did, announcing her the way a herald announces a queen. She was 21 years old, and she had never once in her entire life been overlooked. Eleanor had 5 inches of dark hair that refused to curl properly, eyes of an indeterminate gray-green that her father had once described as the color of a fish pond in November, and a habit of saying precisely what she thought at precisely the wrong moment, which had earned her the reputation in the county of being difficult. She was also, according to 3 consecutive seasons of London society, handsome enough in her way, which was the particular cruelty of English understatement at its most refined. It was a Tuesday in late October when everything changed. Eleanor would remember that detail with peculiar clarity long afterward, not the date, not the year, but the day of the week, as though Tuesdays in particular could not be trusted. She was in the library when her father summoned her, not because she had been sent for, she hadn't, not yet, but because she had heard the carriage arrive on the gravel drive outside the east window, had seen the crest on the door from her position behind the curtain, where she had retreated with a volume of natural philosophy and a cup of rapidly cooling tea, and had recognized, with the particular prescience of someone who pays close attention to things others consider beneath their notice, either that the afternoon was about to become complicated. The Ashworth Library was the best room in Whitmore Park, in Eleanor's opinion, though she had never said so aloud. Saying so would have invited questions about why she preferred it to the drawing room, and those questions would have led inevitably to observations about how a young woman of her age and situation ought to prefer the drawing room, ought to prefer society and display and the careful performance of femininity over the quiet company of books and her own thoughts. Eleanor had learned long ago to keep her preferences to herself. It was simpler. She pulled back the curtain just enough to see. The carriage was black, lacquered to a shine that spoke of money so established it no longer needed to announce itself. The horses were matched bays, perfectly formed, attended by grooms in dark livery who moved with the practiced efficiency of people who understood that their employer did not tolerate incompetence. And the man who descended from the carriage, she caught only a glimpse, a tall figure in a coat that fit with the kind of precision that suggested it had been made by someone very good, and altered not once since, moved toward the front door with the unhurried certainty of a man who was accustomed to the world, arranging itself around his arrival. The Duke of Ashvale. She had known, of course, that he was expected. The entire county had known. Her father had spoken of little else for the past fortnight, with the particular breathless energy of a man who has staked something important on a single outcome. The Duke of Ashvale, Edward Cavendish, 5th of that title, 32 years of age, a master of 3 estates, possessor of a fortune that had been described in various drawing rooms as considerable, immense, and by one enthusiastic matron quite beyond imagining, was coming to look at his neighbors, to take stock of the county, to, as everyone understood without saying directly, find himself a wife. Eleanor had known all of this. She had simply chosen not to think about what it meant. She was thinking about it now. Eleanor. Her father's voice carried from the corridor. Eleanor, where on earth are you? Come down immediately. She replaced the volume of natural philosophy on its shelf, smoothed her skirt, gray muslin, practical, chosen that morning without any anticipation of being presented to a duke, and descended the stairs with the unhurried calm of someone who has decided that whatever is about to happen, she will face it with her dignity intact. Her father was in the entrance hall. Lord Ashworth was a compact, energetic man who had once been handsome and was now merely florid, with the slightly frantic expression he wore whenever something he wanted very badly appeared to be within reach. Beside him stood Arabella, resplendent in her morning gown of pale yellow muslin, her golden hair arranged in perfect ringlets, already smiling the smile she reserved for important occasions, practiced, brilliant, and just slightly too perfect to be entirely genuine. And across from them, filling the entrance hall with a presence that Eleanor could only describe to herself afterward as gravitational, stood the Duke of Ashvale. There she is. Her father's voice carried the particular relief of a man who has feared something would go wrong and found that it hasn't, yet. Your Grace, may I present my daughters? Arabella, my eldest. He gestured toward Arabella with the proprietary pride of a man displaying his best thoroughbred. And Eleanor, a fractional pause. My younger girl. Eleanor did not miss the pause. She had been not missing pauses of that particular kind her entire life. She curtsied with the smooth correctness of someone who had been taught well and practiced often, keeping her eyes appropriately lowered in that first moment of formal introduction. When she raised them, she found the Duke of Ashvale looking at her, not at Arabella, at her. It was only a moment, the span of a breath, to the time it takes a candle flame to recover from a draught. And then his gaze moved on, sweeping the hall with the kind of comprehensive assessment that took in everything at once without appearing to linger on anything at all. But Eleanor, who had spent a lifetime attending to details others overlooked, had seen it. The fraction of a second in which his eyes had met hers, and something had shifted, almost imperceptibly, in his expression. She told herself she had imagined it. Your Grace honors us with his visit, her father was saying, his voice pitched at the particular frequency of eager deference. We are most grateful, most honored. Please come through to the drawing room. We have prepared. Lord Ashworth. The Duke's voice was quieter than Eleanor had expected. Not soft. Precisely. There was nothing soft about it, but controlled, measured. The voice of a man who had learned that he did not need to raise it in order to be heard. You are very kind. I hope I do not inconvenience your household. Not at all, not at all. We are entirely at your disposal. Eleanor followed them into the drawing room and took the chair farthest from the center of the room, which was also the chair with the best angle for observation, and settled in to watch. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. What she watched over the next 2 hours of tea and careful conversation. It was this: her father performing the role of gracious host with the slightly desperate energy of a man who knows the performance is necessary. Arabella performing the role of perfect English beauty with the practiced ease of long experience, and the Duke of Ashvale performing the role of... She struggled to name it. He was polite, he was attentive, in a precise, deliberate way. He asked questions and listened to the answers with an expression of such careful neutrality that Eleanor could not determine whether he was interested or merely courteous. He was not, she noticed, particularly warm. He spoke to Arabella with the same measured regard with which he spoke to her father, which was either admirable consistency or a complete absence of the particular spark of interest that her father was so desperately hoping to ignite. But he did not laugh at Arabella's prettily delivered observations about the recent assembly in the village, though he smiled, a brief controlled thing that reached his eyes only partially. He was, Eleanor decided, a man accustomed to concealment, not dishonesty, not exactly, she did not think he was lying about anything, but the particular kind of concealment that comes from having learned, probably young, that displaying what one truly thinks and feels is a luxury that certain positions in life do not permit. She recognized the condition, having suffered from a version of it herself for most of her life, though for rather different reasons. Once, during a brief lull in the conversation, when Arabella had leaned toward their father to murmur something, and the Duke had set down his teacup and turned to survey the room with that comprehensive, apparently casual gaze, his eyes landed on Eleanor. She was holding a small book she had slipped from the shelf beside her chair, a collection of essays on agricultural improvement which had been left there by her father, and which she had been reading with genuine interest while appearing, she hoped, to be merely sitting decorously. She had not expected to be caught at it. "What are you reading?" he asked. The question was quiet, directed at her alone, beneath the murmur of her father and Arabella's exchange. Eleanor looked up and met his eyes directly. Gray, she registered, a darker gray than her own, and more readable than the rest of him, and decided, in the half-second she had available, that pretending she had not been reading would be both obvious and undignified. "Mr. Young's essays on crop rotation," she said. "Your tenants, I believe, have trialed his method for the eastern fields at Ashvale. The yield improvement in the 3rd year is remarkable." A silence, not the silence of incomprehension, but of surprise. "You have read the report," he said. "I have read most of what has been published on the subject," Eleanor said, and then, because she could not seem to stop herself, "The eastern approach is sound, but there is a question about drainage in clay-heavy soil that none of the current literature addresses satisfactorily. I should think the 3rd-year yield might have been even higher with adequate attention to that particular variable." Her father had noticed. She could see it in the way his head had turned very slightly toward her, the way his expression had shifted into the particular combination of irritation and anxiety that meant she had done something he would want to speak to her about later, privately, at length. The Duke of Ashvale looked at her for a moment that stretched just slightly longer than politeness strictly required. "You are quite right about the drainage," he said. Then Arabella laughed at something, a bright silvery sound that redirected all available attention like a compass needle finding north, and the moment dissolved as though it had never been. Eleanor looked back at her book. Her heart, she noticed with some annoyance, was beating faster than was strictly warranted by a brief exchange about soil drainage. It was several days later that her father came to find her in the garden. Eleanor was in the kitchen garden rather than the ornamental one, another choice that would have prompted observations had she made it in company, cutting back the last of the autumn herbs with the focused attention she brought to any task that involved her hands and permitted her mind to roam freely. The day was cold and gray-bright, the kind of October afternoon that smelled of turned earth and distant rain, and she was entirely content, or would have been, had she not seen her father approaching with the expression she privately called his proposition face. "Eleanor," he stopped at the gate, "come inside. I need to speak with you." "Of course." She stripped off her gardening gloves and followed him without asking questions, because she had found over the years that questions extended the preamble unnecessarily. Better to reach the thing itself directly. He brought her to his study, which was significant. The study was where serious conversations happened. He sat behind his desk, which was more significant still. He was putting the desk between them like a barrier, which meant he expected resistance. "Ashvale has been in contact," he began. Eleanor waited. "He wishes to call again, this Thursday." Her father paused, and in that pause, Eleanor heard everything he was not saying. "He has expressed a particular interest in... He has asked specifically whether you would be available." She held very still. "Not Arabella," her father continued, and the words seemed to cost him something, a currency she could not quite name. "He made the inquiry about you specifically, Eleanor. I want to be certain I understood the message correctly. He asked for me," Eleanor said carefully. "Yes." Her father's expression was complicated. She had seen him look at her with impatience, with exasperation, with the particular bewilderment of a man who has produced a daughter he cannot entirely categorize. She could not remember when she had last seen him look at her with this expression, something that, if she were generous, she might call hope. "He asked for you specifically. He said..." A brief pause. "He said he found your conversation on Thursday to be the most interesting he had experienced in some time." Eleanor thought of crop rotation, or she thought of clay-heavy soil and drainage, and the brief unguarded moment when the Duke of Ashvale had looked at her as though she were something he had not expected to find. "I see," she said. "Now, Eleanor." Her father leaned forward. "I want to be clear with you. Arabella will make a very good match. She is young, she is lovely, there will be other opportunities. But this, Ashvale, is..." He searched for words adequate to the situation. "This would be extraordinary, for all of us, for the estate, for your sister's prospects. I want you to understand the significance." Eleanor understood the significance perfectly. She had understood it from the moment she had first heard the Duke's name spoken in connection with their family. What she was only now beginning to understand was that the Duke himself might be something different from her imagination of him. "I will receive him on Thursday," she said simply. Her father blinked. He had clearly prepared arguments for the eventuality of her reluctance. He had not prepared for simple agreement. "Well," he said, "yes, good. I'm glad you are being sensible about this." Eleanor returned to the garden. She put her gloves back on and finished cutting back the herbs with the same methodical attention she had brought to the task before. But her mind was not roaming freely now. It was fixed, with uncomfortable precision, on a pair of dark gray eyes and the particular quality of a silence between two people who have just said something true. He came on Thursday. Eleanor was in the drawing room this time, or by design, wearing her second-best afternoon dress, a deep green wool that Arabella had once described as not exactly festive, but at least it is not gray, and she had arranged herself in the chair nearest the window with the natural philosophy volume she had been genuinely reading, and which she was entirely prepared to be caught reading if it came to that. She had decided, somewhere between Tuesday night and Thursday morning, that there was no earthly point in beginning anything on a foundation of pretense. If the Duke of Ashvale was interested in the version of her that talked about soil drainage, then she would be that version. If it was not what he wanted, it was better to know that now. Arabella was also in the drawing room. This had not been Eleanor's choice, but she understood it. Their father could hardly exclude his beautiful eldest daughter from a social call, even one that had been specifically directed at his overlooked second. Arabella had settled herself on the settee with the instinctive grace of someone who always knows where the light falls best and manages to be in it, and she was working at her embroidery with the serene confidence of a woman who has never, in her life, been overlooked in any room she has entered. The Duke arrived exactly when he had said he would. Eleanor watched him enter and noticed again what she had noticed on Tuesday, the way he took stock of a room without appearing to, the way his attention moved with quiet efficiency from point to point. She noticed the moment he located her. She saw the fractional shift in his posture, why so small as to be almost invisible, and thought, he was looking for me specifically. The thought did something peculiar to her breathing. He was presented to them again, formally, because formality was the scaffolding on which English social life was constructed, and then he accepted tea and sat down and the afternoon began. Eleanor waited. She was good at waiting. She had been waiting her entire life for something, though she could not always have said what. He spoke to Arabella with perfect courtesy. He spoke to her father about estate matters with genuine engagement, and then, at a natural lull in the conversation, he turned to Eleanor and said with the same quiet directness he had used on Tuesday, "I spoke with my estate manager about the drainage question." Arabella looked up from her embroidery. Her father made a small sound. "And," Eleanor said, "you were correct. We have been addressing yield without addressing the underlying condition that limits it. He is drawing up a plan for a drainage channel along the eastern boundary. He estimates it will improve the third-year yield by a further 8%. Minimum." "That is very pleasing," Eleanor said, and then, because she couldn't not, "though I should think 12% is more likely if the channel's graded properly and the outfall positioned before the clay seam." Silence. "I will pass that on," the Duke said. And he was smiling, not the brief, controlled expression she had seen on Tuesday, but something that reached his eyes fully, something that had warmth in it, and Eleanor felt the peculiar sensation of a wall somewhere inside her, a wall she had not quite known was there, developing a crack. So Arabella looked between them with an expression that was not quite bewilderment and not quite something else. Eleanor's father looked as though he were witnessing events whose implications he had not yet fully processed. "My sister," Arabella said, with a lightness that was practiced rather than natural, "has always had a great affinity for agricultural matters. I confess I find it difficult to share her enthusiasm." "That is a pity," the Duke said, with perfect politeness and absolutely no indication that he intended it as anything other than a straightforward statement of fact. Eleanor looked at the window to hide the expression that had, without her permission, arrived on her face. He stayed for 2 hours. He spoke on a range of subjects: the political situation in Parliament, the recent exhibition of natural philosophy in London, a question of local infrastructure that affected several neighboring estates. He addressed most of his remarks to the room generally, but his attention, Eleanor slowly realized, kept returning to her. Not obtrusively, not in a way that could have been called improper, but with the consistency of a compass returning to north, as though she were the fixed point by which he was orienting the conversation. She was not accustomed to being anyone's fixed point. When he rose to leave, he made his farewells to Arabella and to her father with the same measured courtesy he had shown throughout. And then he turned to Eleanor and said, "I believe there is an excellent library at Thornwick, the nearest market town. They have recently acquired a collection of agricultural and scientific texts from the estate of a recently deceased natural philosopher. If you were to find yourself in the village any Thursday, the lending library is open." He said it evenly, directly, without any of the careful social indirection with which such invitations were usually extended, as though he had simply decided to say what he meant and trusted her to understand it. "I often find myself in the village on Thursdays," Eleanor said. "How fortunate," he said, and he left. Arabella was staring at her. Their father was staring at her. Eleanor set down her tea, folded her hands in her lap, and said nothing at all. Later that evening, after supper, her father came to her sitting room. "He's interested in you," her father said, and the words seemed to cost him something, not because he begrudged her the attention, she thought, but because he genuinely could not understand it. "Eleanor, I believe he is genuinely interested in you." "I had gathered as much," Eleanor said. Do you share the interest?" She thought about gray eyes and agricultural drainage, and a smile that had reached all the way to its owner's eyes only in the moment when she had said something true and inconvenient. She thought about the particular quality of being seen, actually seen, the inconvenient reality of her rather than the convenient absence of it, and what that felt like after a lifetime of studied invisibility. "I think," she said carefully, "that I should like to know him better." Her father exhaled slowly. "He is a man of considerable—" He paused. "I have made inquiries. He's considered difficult, cold. He keeps his own counsel and does not invite familiarity. He was engaged once, 7 years ago. It did not. The engagement ended badly. Since then, he has been—" Another pause. "He has been alone." Eleanor thought about the controlled, measured quality of the Duke of Ashvale. She thought about a man who had learned that certain things needed to be concealed and wondered what had taught him that lesson, and at what cost. "I see," she said. "I want you to be careful," her father said, and she recognized with some surprise that he meant it. "He is, whatever else he may be, Eleanor. He is powerful. And powerful men can—" "Thank you, father," she said. "I will be careful." He left. Eleanor sat by the window in the dark for a long time, watching the October stars emerge from behind moving clouds, and thought about all the ways in which a person could learn to make themselves invisible, and whether, when someone offered to see them clearly, it was wisdom or foolishness to let them. The lending library in Thornwick was, indeed, excellent. Eleanor discovered this on the following Thursday, when she arrived in the village ostensibly to collect a parcel of fabric her mother had ordered from the draper. And actually, she admitted to herself with the honesty she had learned to practice in private, if not in public, because a man with dark gray eyes had told her the library was open on Thursdays. He was already there when she arrived. He was standing at a shelf near the back of the small room, a volume open in one hand, and an expression of focused attention on his face that she suspected he shared with precisely nobody when he thought himself unobserved. He looked different here than he had in her father's drawing room, less contained, or less perfectly assembled. He had removed his greatcoat and draped it over a chair, and his dark hair, which had been impeccable at Whitmore Park, had been slightly disarranged by what had clearly been an impatient hand. He was reading about something that interested him, and the interest had made him forget to be careful. She found it against all common sense and every lesson about self-preservation she had ever taught herself, quite extraordinarily appealing. He looked up when she entered. The expression of unself-conscious absorption vanished, replaced by the controlled neutrality she had come to recognize as his default. But before it vanished entirely, in the single unguarded second between unobserved and observed, she saw something else, something that looked very much like pleasure. "Miss Ashworth," he said. "Your Grace." She curtsied, which felt slightly absurd in a lending library with 3 other patrons absorbed in their own reading. "I did not expect to find you here." It was not true. They both knew it was not true. She said it anyway, because honesty, she had learned, could be deployed strategically, and there were certain truths that needed to be approached obliquely before they could be faced directly. "I am often here on Thursdays," he said, with the same quality of careful straightforwardness. "The collection is, as I mentioned, excellent." "So I see." She moved past him to the shelf, and he shifted to give her room, and for a moment they stood side by side, looking at the spines of books in the comfortable silence of 2 people who have each, independently, spent a great deal of time in libraries and know how to exist in them without requiring conversation. "This," he said eventually, holding out the volume he had been reading, "may be of interest. It is a treatise on soil chemistry. German originally, but translated adequately. It addresses, among other things, the behavior of clay-heavy substrates under various drainage conditions." Eleanor took it from him. Their fingers did not touch. She was aware of not touching. She looked at the first page of the treatise and felt the sharp, clean pleasure of encountering a text that is going to tell her something she wants to know. "This is exactly what I was looking for," she said, and meant it entirely. "I thought it might be." He paused. "There's a table by the window, if you would care to read for a time. He glanced at the shelf. "I have other things to look at. I did not mean to suggest—" "I would like that very much," Eleanor said. So they read. For an hour and a half, in a lending library in Thornwick, they sat at adjacent tables and read about soil chemistry and, in his case, something she could not see the title of. And occasionally one of them would look up and the other would already be looking at something else, and the afternoon light shifted slowly through the dusty windows, and the other patrons came and went, and neither of them paid any attention to any of it. It was the most comfortable hour and a half Eleanor had spent in longer than she could easily calculate. When the library began to close, they gathered their things in a silence that had become, she realized, companionable rather than formal. He held the door for her. Outside, the October afternoon had turned cold and pink, the light going golden at the edges the way October light does when it has decided to be beautiful on its way out. "I called on Lord Ashworth yesterday," the Duke said as they stood on the library steps. It was not a non sequitur. She had known this was coming. "I know," she said, a pause. "He told you." "He told me that you had expressed an interest in calling again." More formally. She kept her voice even. "He expressed the hope that I would be receptive." "And are you?" The question was direct, almost blunt. She had the impression that he was someone who, once he had decided to say a thing, said it without the usual diplomatic circumlocutions. "I think," she said, choosing her words with care, "that I am someone who prefers to understand a situation clearly before committing to a position within it, and I do not yet entirely understand this situation." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What would you like to understand?" Eleanor looked at the October light on the village rooftops. She had not expected that question. She was not sure what she had expected. Reassurance, perhaps. Social formula. Some version of the usual performance. "Why me?" she said simply and directly. "I am not. There is no obvious reason, Your Grace. I am not the daughter my father would have presented. I am not the one who is—" She stopped herself before she said, "beautiful," which felt too bare. "I am not the conventional choice, and you are a man who is, by all appearances, very deliberate in his choices. So I find myself wondering what it is you think you are choosing." The pause that followed was long enough that she began to wonder whether she had gone too far, had committed the old error of saying the true thing at the wrong moment. Then he turned to look at her fully, with the same quality of attention he had given the book he'd been reading earlier, focused, unguarded, intent. "I am choosing," he said carefully, "someone who talks about drainage with genuine enthusiasm when she thinks no one is listening, someone who reads natural philosophy behind drawing-room curtains, someone who says what she thinks even when she knows it is inconvenient, and who asks the question that everyone else is carefully not asking." He paused. "I have spent 12 years," he said more quietly, "in rooms full of people performing for each other. I find I am very tired of performance." Eleanor looked at him. She thought about walls and the cracks in them. She thought about 12 years of careful concealment and what that must cost, day after day, year after year. "I see," she said. And then, because she was Eleanor Ashworth and she had decided there would be no pretense, "I should warn you that I am not always easy to be around. I say inconvenient things. I have opinions about agricultural policy. I do not perform well in drawing rooms. I've been called difficult, Your Grace, by people who know me very well." "Yes," he said, and he was smiling again, that real smile, the one that reached his eyes. "I had noticed." She felt the crack in that wall widen just slightly. Just enough. "I will receive your call," she said, "formally, and as you have requested." "Thank you," he said, and then, with the same careful directness, "Miss Ashworth, I'm asking, not assuming, if I might use your Christian name, eventually, when it is appropriate." It was such a carefully qualified request, so precisely bounded by acknowledgement of what was proper. She found, to her surprise, that it moved her, this man who was powerful enough that he rarely had to ask for anything, asking. "Eleanor," she said, "my name is Eleanor." "Edward," he said. And for a moment, standing on the library steps in the dying October light, they looked at each other with the recognition of two people who have been, each in their own way, alone for a very long time and have just realized, with something between terror and relief, that they may not have to be. Then a carriage rattled past and the moment dissolved, as moments do, and he handed her into her own vehicle with correct formality, and she drove away through the October evening with the soil chemistry treatise in her lap, and the particular uncomfortable awareness that something in her life had just shifted on its axis, and that nothing that followed was going to be entirely as she had planned. She had not planned very much, if she were honest. She had spent so long making herself small, making herself invisible, accommodating the expectations of a world that had decided she was the lesser daughter, that she had not done very much planning of the sort that assumed she herself might be the protagonist of something. She was beginning to think, done with the peculiar disorientation of someone who has been walking in the dark and suddenly encountered light, that she might have been wrong about that. The thought was terrifying. It was also, she noticed, the most alive she had felt in years. Edward Cavendish, 5th Duke of Ashvale, drove back to Thornwick Hall through the gathering dusk and did not think about drainage at all. He thought about gray-green eyes that were not, he had decided, anything like a fish pond in November. They were the color of the sea in autumn, changing, deep, giving away more than their owner probably intended when something caught her attention and she forgot to be careful about what her face was showing. He had noticed that. The moments when she forgot. They were the most interesting moments he had encountered in a very long time. Yet he had not wanted to come to Derbyshire. He had been pressed to it by a combination of his estate manager, who had concerns about the northern properties that required his personal attention, and his solicitor, who had concerns of an entirely different nature, concerns about succession, about the future of the title, about the Duke's continued and apparently deliberate avoidance of the entire question of marriage. He had permitted himself to be pressed. He had arrived in the county with the intention of completing his business efficiently and returning to London without entanglements. Then he had walked into the entrance hall of Whitmore Park and found a woman standing in the back of the group, holding a book she had clearly been reading and looking at him with an expression of such clear, direct assessment that he had felt absurdly, or as though he were the one being evaluated. He had not been evaluated in some time, not genuinely. Most people performed in his presence rather than perceiving him, and he had learned to accept that as the natural consequence of his position and to feel nothing in particular about it. The woman in the back of the group had not performed. She had watched and considered and kept her own counsel in a way that he recognized, because he did the same. That had been the first thing. The second had been the conversation about crop rotation, which had been brief and quiet and entirely unexpected, and which had produced in him something he had not felt in a social setting for longer than he cared to calculate, the sensation of genuine engagement, of speaking to someone who was actually thinking, who had actual thoughts of her own that she was sharing rather than carefully crafting an impression. He had thought about it for the rest of the afternoon. He had thought about it, if he was honest with himself, for the rest of the week. He was not supposed to be doing this. He had made, 7 years ago, a decision about the kind of life he would lead after the engagement had ended, and the particular form of devastation it had produced had finally, slowly, subsided into the dull ache of something he had learned to carry. He had decided that certain things, not marriage, not duty, he would fulfill his duty, but certain things of a more private nature were not for him. That the cost was too high, that he was not perhaps built for them. Eleanor Ashworth was making him reconsider that decision. It was alarming. It was also, and he would admit this to no one, not his estate manager, not his solicitor, not the cold walls of Thornwick Hall. It was the first genuinely interesting thing that had happened to him in years. He arrived home and went directly to his library, which was large and well-appointed and entirely empty, as it always was in the evenings. He poured himself a glass of brandy, which he did not drink, and sat looking at the fire, which he did not see, and thought about a woman who had asked him, with the serene directness of someone who has decided that pretense is simply too much work, exactly what he thought he was choosing. He had told her the truth. He had not intended to, not so directly, not so quickly. But she had asked him something real, and he had found, almost without deciding to, that he could only answer it honestly. He was choosing someone real. It was, he was beginning to understand, rarer than it should be. The question was what it would cost them both to see it through. He thought of the woman he had been engaged to years ago. He thought of the particular way beauty and charm could conceal an absolute absence of the things that actually mattered. He thought of learning that lesson at the age of 25, when the cost of learning it had been significant. He was not going to make that mistake again. Eleanor Ashworth was not beautiful in the conventional sense. She was not charming in the practiced way. She said inconvenient things and read agricultural essays in drawing rooms and asked questions that other people were carefully not asking. She was difficult, probably, by the measures the world used to judge such things. He found, to his considerable surprise, that he did not mind difficulty at all. He picked up his brandy and looked at the fire. For the first time in 7 years, he thought about the future with something other than obligation. It felt, tentatively, almost like hope. The formal calls began the following week. There were 3 of them in November, each conducted with the correct observance of propriety, her father present, or Arabella, or occasionally both. But Eleanor noticed that the witnesses gradually stopped witnessing in any meaningful sense. Her father developed an interest in the window. Arabella discovered pressing matters in her embroidery, and the conversations between Eleanor and Edward Cavendish continued, careful and genuine and building, brick by careful brick, towards something neither of them had named aloud. And they talked about everything. That was the thing she had not expected, not the breadth of his intelligence, which she had inferred from the beginning, but the quality of his listening. He listened the way she had always wished to be listened to, with his full attention, without the faint glaze that came over most people's eyes when she said something beyond the expected path of feminine conversation. He disagreed with her sometimes about parliamentary reform, about tenant relations, once at considerable length about the relative merits of 2 competing theories of soil chemistry. And his disagreements were the most satisfying conversations she had ever had, because they were built on the premise that her opinion was worth the effort of contradicting. She had not known until Edward Cavendish how hungry she had been for exactly that, Arabella noticed. Of course she did. It began with small things, comments at dinner about Eleanor's dress, observations made within Eleanor's hearing that the Duke was very kind to take such an interest in her opinions. One evening, when their father had retired and they sat alone with their needlework, Arabella said, "He is amusing himself. Men of his position marry for alliance, for beauty. He will find this diversion charming for a few weeks, and then he will return to London and marry Lord Pemberton's eldest, who is 18 and has £40,000. Perhaps, Eleanor said, you are not going to argue with me. I have no information that would allow me to argue usefully. You may be entirely correct. Arabella's needle stilled. Something shifted in her expression, less the practiced confidence of someone who expects to win, and more, Eleanor thought, something like uncertainty. Do you like him? She asked, unexpectedly unguarded. Eleanor considered several answers and settled on the truth. Yes, she said quietly. I do. The silence that followed was long. Then I hope, Arabella said finally, that he is worthy of it. It was the kindest thing her sister had said to her in years. The fourth call came with snow. He arrived on horseback rather than carriage, impractical, speaking of a decision made quickly, of someone who had thought about staying away and decided not to. Her father was confined to his bed with a chill, which left only Eleanor and Arabella in the drawing room. Arabella drew herself to the far end of the settee with the manner of someone performing tact so openly it became invisible, and after a while it was simply Eleanor and Edward, as close to the fire, close enough to each other that she was aware of every small movement. He told her, that afternoon, about Caroline, about the simultaneous engagements, the casual calculation, the public humiliation at 25. I am not telling you this for sympathy, he said, turning from the fire to look at her directly. I am telling you because the complete answer to your question, what I thought I was choosing, is this. Someone whose character I can see, not perform for. Someone who talks to me as though I am simply a person. Eleanor felt the wall within her crack further. Not the small fracture of the library steps, but something more significant, a fissure that let in light. When he said quietly, I should like to speak to your father. If you are willing, she thought about all the walls she had built, all the invisibility she had cultivated, all the small, patient griefs of a life spent as a footnote in someone else's story. I am willing, she said. Her father recovered from his chill within the week. Afterward, he came to Eleanor's sitting room and said, in a voice quieter than she expected, I owe you an apology. I have not always seen you clearly. This man sees you. That is worth more than I knew to look for. I'm sorry it took me so long to understand that. Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest that had been tightened for a very long time. The engagement was announced quietly. The reactions were varied. There was shock. There was bewilderment among those who had organized their understanding around a fixed principle that Arabella Ashworth was the marriageable sister, and found that principle suddenly wrong. Mrs. Hatherley, their nearest neighbor for 30 years, took Eleanor's hands and said, I always said you were the one. I always said there was more in you than they knew how to find. Eleanor excused herself to the garden for a quarter-hour and stood in the cold December air and breathed. Arabella withdrew. Not dramatically, she was too intelligent for scenes. But the small fraternities of sisterhood disappeared, replaced by a cool, impeccable politeness that was in some ways worse than anger. Eleanor tried once to address it directly. I know this is not what you expected. I am not asking you to feel nothing. Arabella looked up, her expression beautifully controlled. I have spent 21 years being told I was the one, she said at last, and then the moment came, and he looked past me as though I were furniture. Eleanor was quiet. I am sorry the world taught you that lesson, she said finally. I am not sorry he looked past you, but I am sorry for what it cost you. Arabella looked at her for a long moment. You always were the strange one, she said, but her voice had lost its edge. After that it was not warm between them, but it was honest, which was perhaps a better foundation for the long term. Lady Harrington, Edward's cousin by marriage, arrived on a Tuesday with the surface warmth of a congratulatory call and the undertone of a reconnaissance. She said all the correct things, and then, as she was leaving, she turned to Eleanor and said, "I do hope it proves lasting. He can be changeable when his attention is caught and then released." Eleanor met her gaze. "Your Grace is very kind," she said smoothly. Lady Harrington left. Eleanor went directly to the library and stood among the shelves until her breathing steadied. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. January brought London. Eleanor navigated the first calls, the first dinners, the first rooms full of people looking at her with that particular combination of curiosity and assessment. Edward was beside her, steady, constant, present. She depended on that more than she had intended to depend on anything, and told herself it was all right to depend on something solid. Then the letter arrived. It was addressed to Edward. She did not read it. She would be clear about that afterward. But she noticed the handwriting was a woman's. And when Edward returned and opened his post, she saw the change in his posture when he reached that particular letter. He read it twice and sat very still. "What is it?" she asked. The controlled neutrality had returned to his face, the deliberate kind, the concealment of something being managed. "Nothing of consequence," he said. She said nothing more. But the fear she had been keeping carefully managed pressed its advantage, and she felt the cold begin to move in. The following morning at breakfast, she tried again. "The letter yesterday. I'm not asking you to tell me everything, but I'm asking you not to lie to me about whether something exists." A long silence. "It was from Caroline," he said. "She is recently widowed. She has written to offer congratulations, and to say she would welcome the opportunity to speak with me in person." Eleanor set down her coffee cup. "And what do you want to do?" "I want to do nothing. I have no desire to see her." "Edward," she kept her voice very steady, "if you are certain, I believe you. But you did not tell me last night. You said it was nothing, and it was not nothing, and you knew it when you said it." The words landed. She saw them land. "I did not want to worry you," he said. "That," she said quietly, "is not an excuse I can accept. I told you from the beginning, I need honesty, not management, not protection from things you have decided might distress me." "Honesty," he exhaled. "You are right. I will write to her today and decline. The engagement stands." "All right," Eleanor said. They sat with the coffee going cold between them, and she felt the tightness in her chest begin, slowly, to ease. He had faltered, and then he had told her the truth. She thought that might be enough. She thought it might be more than enough. She did not yet know what was coming. She did not know about the story being assembled in drawing rooms, not the story of an unsuitable woman who had caught a duke above her station, but something worse. A woman who had positioned herself in that lending library with calculation, who had exploited a vulnerable man's loneliness to insert herself into a situation she had engineered from the beginning. She found out on a Friday at a small dinner she attended alone. Halfway through the fish course, a woman across the table said, with the casual cruelty of someone repeating what is known, "But I heard you and Ashvale had an arrangement before the engagement was announced. A private arrangement in a library that he felt honor-bound to formalize." The table went quiet. Eleanor looked at the woman across from her. She thought about the library in Thornwick, and the soil chemistry treatise, and the afternoon light on the dusty windows, and the particular irreplaceable quality of an hour and a half spent reading beside someone who had looked for her specifically. She set down her fish fork. "No," she said with perfect calm. "That is not what happened." She picked up her fish fork. "The Duke of Ashvale is a man of precise honesty and considerable character. If anyone has heard otherwise, I suspect they have been speaking to someone who knows him very little." She smiled with the full, clear, but direct smile she had spent a lifetime withholding. "Please do pass the wine." The dark morning came quietly, with the particular gray light of January that makes everything look as though it has already been defeated. Eleanor was already awake when Edward's knock came. 3 sharp, even raps, the knock of someone who has decided to do something. He entered with his cravat loose, his hair not attended to, a letter from Lady Harrington on the table between them, a story circulating that the lending library had been chosen for assignations, that Eleanor had engineered the engagement to escape a prior entanglement. "And," Eleanor said. Her voice was steady. She was holding it steady with everything she had. "And nothing," he said immediately. "Then, I heard something at my club last night. I came home and said nothing. I know I should have told you, and I did not." A silence. "And for a moment," Eleanor said carefully, "you wondered." The silence that followed was very long. "Yes," he said. "For a moment. I'm ashamed of it. But yes." She looked at his back, turned toward the window, where he had gone to manage something that had not finished arriving, and thought about October and November and the library and every Thursday. She thought about what it cost a person to have been betrayed in the specific way he had been betrayed, and what that cost does to a person's ability to trust. She also thought about what it would mean to stay with a man who, in the moment of testing, had turned toward the lie. "Look at me," she said. He turned. His face was stripped of everything. The control, the careful architecture, all of it gone. "And I have never," Eleanor said, each word placed with precision, "in my life, been anything other than what I appear to be. I sat in that library and talked about soil chemistry, because I was interested in soil chemistry and because you asked me to be there. Every moment of every Thursday and every letter I have written to you has been completely and entirely real." She paused. "I'm going to tell you something I have not said. I love you. I have loved you since November, I think. Or perhaps since the library. I cannot entirely determine which. I say it now because I want you to understand the weight of what is at stake for me in this room. And I am telling you that I will not build a marriage on the terms that were almost established here this morning. I will not accept management and silence in place of honesty." Her voice threatened to fracture. She held it. "I will not be invisible again, not for anyone, not even for you." Edward crossed the room in 3 strides and took both her hands in both of his and looked at her with the full, stripped, unguarded face of someone who has nothing left to hide and has decided to stop hiding it. I wondered for a moment and was ashamed of it, and then I lay awake, knowing I had done the one thing you asked me not to do. I'm having this conversation now because you were right. You are always right about the things that matter, and I refuse to let my fear cost the people who depend on me everything they need. I cannot promise it will never happen again. I can promise that when it does, I will come to you with it instead of from you. I am a slow student." His hands tightened on hers. "But I'm trying harder at this than at anything in my life, because this matters more than anything in my life." Eleanor looked at the ashamed, honest, unguarded face of a man who had faltered, and then told her the truth about faltering. "All right," she said quietly. "I'm still angry. You have every right to be. And still frightened that the next time something arrives to shake your faith in me, you will turn toward it instead of toward me. I know, but I will come to you with it. I promise you that." A pause. "We are going to address this, not as a question. Yes, publicly, directly, today. I will not leave this story standing." "Good," she said. "I love you, Edward. I said it once and I mean it every time, but I need you to match me. Not perfectly, just honestly." "Honest," he said, "I can do." She chose to believe him, which was not the same as having no choice, and was more meaningful because of it. What Edward Cavendish did next was not subtle. He went to Lady Harrington in person and told her, with the precise clarity of a man not interested in discussion, that the story was false, and he expected her to use her influence accordingly. She had not argued. "I was mistaken in my sources," she said. "I will say so." He went to his club and corrected the account of the 2 men who had spoken to him the night before. He wrote 3 letters, to the hostess of Eleanor's dinner, to Lord Pemberton, and to his solicitor. Eleanor went to Mrs. Cecily Forthright, the widow of a naval admiral, possessed of a sharp tongue and a complete indifference to social pressure, and told her everything. Mrs. Forthright listened, then said, Leave the morning calls to me, in a tone that did not invite discussion. By afternoon, the story had begun to shift. Eleanor wrote to Arabella, honestly, about the gossip in the letter and the dark morning and what she had decided and why. The reply came 4 days later, short and elegant. You are braver than I gave you credit for. I am beginning to think I have been wrong about a great many things. Come home in spring, and I will try to say so properly. Eleanor read it twice and sat quietly with it. Spring, she thought. There was something to hold on to. The engagement dinner was Edward's idea. We're going to give a dinner, he said, for 50 people. You will be at the head of the table with me, and you will be exactly who you are, and they will see what I see. That is a great deal of confidence, Eleanor said. I have a great deal of confidence in you. She wore blue, the same deep, certain blue she had worn for his first formal call, because she had decided this was a night for being exactly herself. She chose no jewelry except her mother's pearl earrings, which her mother had given her with the instruction to wear them only when she was certain she was in the right place. She was certain. The moment she would remember longest came near the end of the dinner, when Lord Pemberton, large, influential, the sort of man whose opinions travel quickly, said from the far end of the table, Miss Ashworth, is it true you corrected the estate manager at Ashvale on the question of drainage yield? I made a suggestion, she said. The estate manager was good enough to implement it. And the yield improvement? 12% in the 3rd year. As predicted. Lord Pemberton laughed, a real laugh, the kind that fills a room. God, Ashvale, where did you find her? A lending library, Edward said, and looked at Eleanor with the full warmth of his gray eyes, undisguised, entirely visible to every person at the table. She was reading about soil chemistry. The room laughed, the real warm laugh of people who have been shown something genuine and found it delightful. Eleanor felt the last of the cold that had been living in her chest since January began, finally to ease. After the guests had gone, as they sat together in the drawing room in the comfortable silence that was, by now, entirely familiar. I have not said it, he said into that silence. I have shown it, I believe, but I have not said it, and I want to say it now while the candles are burning down. I love you. I have loved you since the library, probably, or since the drawing room when you corrected the drainage estimate and my estate manager turned out to agree with you. I love the way you say inconvenient things at the exact right moment. I love the way you read behind curtains and think I cannot see you. I love you, Eleanor, and I'm going to keep saying it. I will not find it excessive, she said when she could speak. I have spent my entire life being invisible. You are going to have to say it quite a lot. He crossed to her and sat beside her and took her hand. Whispering in, she leaned her head against his shoulder, which was solid and warm and entirely real, and they sat together while the candles burned and the London night went on outside the windows. They were married on the first Saturday of March, in the chapel at Whitmore Park. Arabella stood beside her as witness and had said the night before, looking at Eleanor's dress, blue again, with the tone of someone making peace with something. Always, Eleanor had said, and they had both almost smiled. Edward was waiting at the altar. He turned when she reached him and looked at her with the full, unguarded attention she had come to understand as the truest thing about him. You look like someone who has made a decision, he said quietly. I have been making this decision since October, she said. I am simply making it formally now. He smiled, the full smile, the one that reached his eyes all the way. Since the curtain, he admitted, which she had not known and which made her breath catch. I saw you before you saw me. You were standing in the window with a book, entirely absorbed, and you looked like someone who was exactly where they should be, and I wanted to be wherever that was. Her father found her afterward by the morning room window, looking at the early March garden. I said when he arrived, take the pretty one, he said. I did not say it to him, but I thought it. I arranged you in that entrance hall with the clear expectation that he would look at Arabella. He looked at you. He looked at you because you were the person in the room most worth looking at, and I had not seen that. I am sorry, Eleanor, for all the years of that. She looked at him for a long moment, the florid, compact, earnest man who had tried his best and fallen short and was standing in the morning room light trying to say so. "Thank you for saying it," she said, with the honest warmth the world had sometimes mistaken for coldness because it was not performed. They went to Ashvale. On the fourth evening there, Eleanor was sitting on the library floor among open volumes, hair escaping its pins, a smear of dust on her cheek, entirely absorbed in a comparison of two conflicting theories of soil acidity. Edward sat down on the floor beside her. "Which theory is right?" he asked. "Neither of them," she said, without looking up. "They are both addressing part of the question from the wrong angle. The answer is probably somewhere between them." "Of course it is," he said, and she could hear in his voice that he was smiling, and she looked up, and he was. She thought about October, and all the Thursdays, and the December snow, and the morning in January, and the wedding breakfast, and the journey to Ashvale, all the accumulated weight of a love that had been built rather than arrived at, carefully and honestly, brick by careful brick. "I am happy," she said, and it surprised her, the simplicity of it. "I know," he said. "I can tell. You look different when you are happy." "How do I look?" He considered. "Like yourself, entirely like yourself, without anything held back." She thought about a girl who had learned to be invisible, and a woman who had spent long enough hiding that the hiding had become simply the way things were. She thought about a man with gray eyes who had looked at her across an entrance hall and not looked past her. "I was told for most of my life that I was the wrong one," she said. "I believed it. I made myself invisible because invisible felt safer than being seen and found lacking. And then you came and looked at me and did not look past me, and I did not know what to do with that." "You talked about drainage," he said. "I talked about drainage," she agreed. "It was the truest thing I knew how to say in that moment." He took her hand, there on the library floor among the open volumes. "For the record," he said, "there was nothing missing. There was never anything missing. The world was simply looking in the wrong places." She leaned her head against his shoulder and felt the same solidity, the same real warmth, and the same absolute certainty of a person who is exactly where they should be. "I know," she said. "I know that now." Outside, the March evening moved toward dark, and somewhere in the distance a nightingale was making its early spring attempt at song. She had been the girl in the corner. She had been overlooked and undercounted and filed as the lesser thing. And then a man had walked into a room and looked past the obvious thing, the expected thing, and found her, not despite what she was, but because of it. The stubbornness, the drainage calculations, the reading behind curtains, all of it. She had never been the lesser thing. She had been simply a thing the world did not know how to see. There was a difference, a significant life-altering difference, between being invisible and being unseen. She was not invisible. She never had been. She had only been waiting for someone with the eyes to find her. He had found her. She had let herself be found. And the rest was the ongoing, imperfect, honest, wonderful work of two people who had chosen each other clearly and kept choosing day by day in the accumulated Thursdays of a life. The nightingale outside tried its song again. Got it right this time. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.